The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the city as a black SUV sped down the quiet streets. Inside, a woman sat behind the wheel, her expression calm and collected. She was a high-ranking official in the Drug Enforcement Administration, a position she had worked tirelessly to achieve. Known for her sharp intellect and dedication, she was respected by her colleagues and feared by those involved in criminal activities. Her name was Monica Williams, and she had seen it all: corruption, crime, and betrayal. But that evening, as she navigated through the peaceful neighborhood, she would face an unexpected challenge that would change the course of her evening. Monica had just left a meeting with the DEA's regional office, where she had discussed the latest developments in an ongoing operation targeting a major drug trafficking ring. Her work was demanding, but she had learned to find balance. The long hours were necessary, but they also left little room for personal life. As she drove through the neighborhood, she let her mind wander for a moment. She thought about her family, her upbringing, and the many sacrifices she had made to get where she was today. The weight of her responsibilities often weighed heavily on her, but she took pride in knowing that she was making a difference. The SUV glided through the streets with ease, its tires humming softly on the pavement. Monica's mind was still wrapped around the case she had been working on when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. It was a routine traffic stop, or so she thought. She was well aware of the law and had been pulled over countless times before, but this time felt different. Her instincts told her that something wasn't right. She glanced in the mirror again, noticing the police officer's car pulling up behind her. With a sigh, Monica slowed the SUV to a stop, pulling over to the side of the road. She rolled down her window, her eyes meeting the officer's as he approached. He was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, with a stern look on his face. Monica had dealt with many officers over the years, but this one seemed different. He didn't seem to recognize her, and his demeanor was not as polite as it could have been. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, and she noticed the way his gaze seemed to scrutinize her every move. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Monica was already prepared for this. She had never been one to panic in situations like this. She had faced far more dangerous situations in her career, but something about this moment felt off. She replied calmly, "I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding?" The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "Your brake lights weren't working," he said. "I'll need to take a look at your vehicle." Monica nodded, understanding the procedure. She had seen it all before, and she knew the drill. "Go ahead, officer," she replied. The officer walked to the back of the SUV, examining the brake lights as Monica sat in the driver's seat, watching him through the rearview mirror. She could tell that he was taking his time, more time than was necessary for a routine check. A sense of unease started to creep up on her. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something was off, and this officer's behavior was raising red flags. Moments later, the officer returned to her window, but this time, his demeanor had changed. He wasn't as polite as before. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle, ma'am," he said, his voice now more demanding. Monica raised an eyebrow, surprised by the request. "Excuse me, officer," she replied, her voice steady but with an edge of authority. "Is there a reason for the search?" The officer hesitated, as if considering his response. "I just need to make sure everything's in order," he said. "It won't take long." Monica's mind raced. Something about this officer's behavior didn't sit right with her. She had been pulled over countless times before, and it was unusual for an officer to request a search without a clear reason. She knew her rights, and she knew that she had done nothing wrong. Still, her training as a DEA agent kicked in. She kept her emotions in check, not allowing any sign of distress to show on her face. "Officer," Monica said, her voice calm but firm, I am the director of the DEA. I've been in law enforcement for years. I know the procedure. If you don't have probable cause, you cannot search my vehicle. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't back down. I'm going to search your car, he repeated, his tone unyielding. Monica's heart rate increased, but she remained composed. She had dealt with officers like this before, men who felt the need to exert power over others. She knew how to handle situations like this, but something still felt off. She reached for her phone, intending to call her colleagues at the DEA to inform them of the situation, but before she could dial, the officer motioned for her to step out of the vehicle. I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am, he said, his voice now tinged with a hint of aggression. Monica felt a surge of anger, but she didn't allow it to show. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible. She knew the importance of maintaining control in situations like this. As she stepped away from the SUV, she saw the officer begin to search her car. His movements were deliberate, his eyes scanning every nook and cranny as if he was looking for something specific. The search felt endless. Monica stood on the side of the road, her mind racing. What was he hoping to find? Why was he being so insistent? She had no idea, but her instincts told her that this was no ordinary traffic stop. As the officer continued his search, Monica's thoughts turned to her job at the DEA. She had dedicated her life to fighting the drug trade, to exposing the corruption within law enforcement, and to protecting the innocent. But now, in this moment, she was the one being targeted. Finally, the officer seemed to find what he was looking for. He pulled something from under the seat, a small bag, something that looked suspiciously like drugs. He held it up, his expression satisfied. I found something, he said, his voice smug. Monica's blood ran cold. This was the moment she had feared. She had been in situations like this before, but this time, it was different. She knew that the officer had just planted evidence in her car. Her training, her years of experience, told her that this was no accident. What is that, officer? Monica asked, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. The officer's smile widened. It looks like drugs. I'm going to have to arrest you. Monica couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had spent years working to bring down criminals who used tactics like this to ruin lives. And now, she was the one being framed. But Monica wasn't going to let this go down without a fight. She wasn't just any woman on the street, she was the director of the DEA. And she wasn't about to let this officer get away with his attempt to ruin her career. As the officer reached for his handcuffs, Monica's hand moved to her phone. She called her superior at the DEA and spoke with quiet authority, explaining the situation. She knew this would be resolved, but not without a fight. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this officer get away with what he had done. And that's when the officer realized he had made a grave mistake. The tension in the air was thick, as Monica stood on the side of the road, her heart pounding but her face calm. She had been in tight situations before, but this one felt different. She had been pulled over by officers countless times in her career, but none of those encounters had felt as threatening as this one. The officer, whose name she still didn't know, was now holding up a small bag that looked like something out of a drug bust. Monica's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This was no ordinary traffic stop, and she knew it. The officer's hand was shaking slightly as he held the bag in front of her. He looked at it like it was some great victory. The pride in his eyes was hard to miss. Monica felt a flicker of anger, but she kept it in check. She was trained to stay calm in the face of danger, and this was no exception. Her years in the DEA had taught her how to read people, how to stay one step ahead of those who thought they could play the system. But this officer was playing a dangerous game, one that she wasn't about to let him win. Do you realize what this means? The officer asked, his voice almost triumphant. His expression told Monica that he thought he had just made a huge breakthrough. You're under arrest for possession of illegal drugs. Monica stared at the bag in his hand, her mind working at lightning speed. It didn't take a genius to know that something was wrong here. The officer had planted this evidence in her car. There was no doubt in her mind. She had been trained to spot this kind of thing a mile away, and she wasn't going to let it slide. But she also knew that handling this the wrong way could ruin everything she had worked for. If she lost her composure, she could find herself in a worse situation than she could imagine. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the rush of emotions threatening to take over. She had to stay calm. She had to think clearly. In her mind, she quickly weighed her options. She could argue with the officer, demand that he let her go, but she knew that wouldn't work. Not in this moment. She was a black woman, and she knew all too well how the system could turn against people like her. The officer could twist this however he wanted, and no one would believe her over him. But she wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not without a fight. The officer took a step closer to her, the bag of drugs still in his hand. "I'm placing you under arrest, ma'am," he said, his voice now more authoritative. "Step back from the car." Monica stood her ground. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I am the director of the DEA. I've been in law enforcement for years, and I know exactly what you're trying to do." The officer's expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "I don't care who you are," he snapped. "You've got illegal drugs in your vehicle. I'm following the law, and I'm arresting you." Monica's mind raced. She had to think fast. She wasn't going to let him drag her into a police station on false charges. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to get to where she was. She couldn't let one corrupt officer ruin everything. She took a step back, allowing the officer to think he had the upper hand, then reached for her phone. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. The officer didn't notice at first, too busy with the fake evidence in his hands. Monica quickly dialed her superior at the DEA, hoping he would pick up. Her finger trembled slightly, but she kept her movements steady. Her heart beat in her chest, but she refused to let fear control her. She had to get the word out, to let her colleagues know what was happening. She couldn't fight this alone. The phone rang for what seemed like an eternity, and Monica felt a wave of frustration building inside her. Finally, her superior's voice came through the line, clear and steady. "Monica? What's going on?" her superior asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. "I've been pulled over by a police officer," Monica said, keeping her tone even. "He's planted drugs in my car. I need you to send someone immediately. This is a setup." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Stay calm," her superior said. "We'll take care of this. We'll get someone to you right away." Monica hung up the phone and turned back to the officer, who was still standing in front of her, holding the bag of drugs like it was his ticket to glory. He looked at her with a smug expression, clearly believing he had the upper hand. But Monica wasn't going to let him think he had won. She stood there, watching him as he continued to hold up the bag. Her mind was working in overdrive, but she kept her face neutral, not letting him see the anger or fear that was bubbling up inside her. She couldn't let him see how much this bothered her. If she did, he would know he was getting to her, and that would give him the power he wanted. "I'm not going anywhere," Monica said, her voice steady. "You can't arrest me on these charges. I didn't plant those drugs in my car, and you know it." The officer's expression hardened, but he didn't back down. "You can tell that to the judge," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure he'll believe you." Monica stood still, watching him carefully. She was trying to think of her next move. She knew that her superior would be sending someone to help her, but she couldn't wait around for them to get here. She had to act now, before this officer had a chance to escalate the situation further. She glanced around, looking for anything that could give her an advantage. The officer was too focused on her to notice, but she spotted a small camera mounted on a nearby streetlight. She knew that cameras in public spaces often recorded interactions with law enforcement, and she wondered if this one had captured the whole exchange. The officer seemed to sense that something was off. He glanced up, noticing her gaze shift to the camera. "What's your point?" he asked, his tone defensive. Monica didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step back, giving herself some space. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. "And I'm not going to let you get away with it." The officer scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He could tell that Monica wasn't like the others he had dealt with before. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid. And that scared him more than anything. As the officer stood there, holding the bag of drugs, Monica's mind was already working on her next move. She knew that she had to be patient. She had to wait for her team to arrive, but in the meantime, she wasn't going to let this officer think he had the power. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. She had worked too hard to let someone like him ruin everything. Monica knew the fight was just beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. This was more than just a traffic stop. It was a battle of wits. And she was prepared to win. The air around Monica felt thick, the silence in the street almost deafening as the officer stood before her, holding the bag of drugs with a self-assured smile. Monica's mind was racing at 1,000 miles per hour, but she remained composed, keeping her eyes on the officer, trying to assess his next move. The officer, on the other hand, was clearly confident that he had caught her. He believed that this was his big moment, a triumph over a criminal he had just discovered, a woman who he had no idea was one of the highest-ranking officials in the DEA. Monica's thoughts were racing. She knew the severity of the situation. She had worked in law enforcement for years, and she had encountered corruption, deception, and even dangerous criminals, but never had she been personally targeted like this. This officer, a young man whose name she still didn't know, was out of his depth. He had no idea who he was dealing with, but that was about to change. Monica couldn't let this man get away with what he had done, especially not with everything she had worked for on the line. She stood there, keeping her posture strong and unwavering. She wasn't going to back down, not now, not when it was her career and integrity at stake. But the officer was still determined to make his case. He wasn't going to stop now. He still believed that he had won, that this was the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't aware of the fact that he was about to face a storm that he could never have anticipated. Monica knew she had to stay calm. She knew the situation could escalate quickly if she let her emotions take control. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I told you," she said slowly, her voice calm yet filled with authority, "I didn't plant that bag in my car, and I don't care how much you believe it, I'm not going down without a fight." The officer's smug expression faltered for a moment. For the first time, there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. But it was only for a second. He quickly regained his composure and looked back at her with defiance. "You can say whatever you want, ma'am. But it's on you now. You'll have to explain yourself to a judge." Monica's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't take the bait. She wasn't going to fall into his trap. She knew that if this continued, things could get ugly. But she wasn't going to let him control the narrative. She had to stay in control of this situation. Without breaking eye contact, she took another steady breath and raised her phone to her ear. She had already dialed her superior's number, but this time, she wasn't going to simply report the situation. She had a plan. She had to show the officer that his actions weren't going unnoticed, that this wasn't just some random traffic stop where he could make up the rules as he went. The phone rang for a moment before her superior's voice came through the line. "Monica, what's going on?" "I've been pulled over by a police officer," Monica said quietly but with authority. "He's planted drugs in my car, and he's trying to arrest me for it. I need immediate assistance, and I need backup." Her superior's voice came through clearly, calm but with a sense of urgency. "Stay calm, Monica. We'll send someone right away. Don't engage with him further. We'll handle it." Monica nodded, though she knew her superior couldn't see it. She disconnected the call and looked back at the officer, who had been watching her the entire time. His eyes flickered toward the phone in her hand, his expression changing slightly, as if something had clicked in his mind. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Maybe he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a routine stop. Maybe he was realizing that the woman he had just pulled over wasn't someone he could push around. The officer took a few steps back, glancing at the bag of drugs he had found in her car. Monica could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out what to do next. He clearly didn't expect her to have the connections she did. He probably thought that a simple traffic stop would get him a quick win, but now the reality of the situation was sinking in. He had overstepped, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he stood firm, holding on to the belief that he could still control the situation. "You don't scare me," the officer said, his voice wavering slightly. "You can call whoever you want, but that won't change the fact that I've got evidence." Monica took a moment to process his words, then smiled faintly. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about me being scared. This is about you making a huge mistake, and I'm not going to let it slide." The officer's grip tightened around the bag of drugs. His knuckles were white, but Monica could see the subtle signs of doubt creeping into his posture. He was on the defensive now. He had realized that things were not going as he had planned. He wasn't dealing with just any woman on the side of the road. He was facing someone who had the experience, the connections, and the determination to fight back. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching echoed in the distance. The officer's head whipped toward the noise, and Monica could see the panic flash across his face. His grip on the bag of drugs loosened slightly, and he took a hesitant step back. Monica knew her backup had arrived. The cavalry was on its way, and this officer was about to realize the full extent of his mistake. A sleek black SUV pulled up alongside them, the windows tinted dark enough that Monica couldn't see who was inside. The vehicle came to a stop, and two figures stepped out. Both of them were familiar faces from the DEA, trusted colleagues who had been sent to help her. They weren't just colleagues, though they were allies, and they knew exactly how to handle situations like this. The officer tensed, his eyes flicking between Monica and the newcomers. He had no idea what was about to happen. Monica didn't say a word, she simply stepped aside, allowing her colleagues to approach the officer. The tension in the air was palpable. The officer stood frozen, his earlier bravado slipping away with each passing second. One of Monica's colleagues, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward. He didn't look at the officer right away. Instead, he addressed Monica. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Monica nodded, her expression unshaken. "I'm fine. Just make sure this officer knows what he's done." The colleague turned his attention to the officer, who was now visibly sweating. The officer tried to speak, but his words were barely audible. I was just doing my job. I found the drugs in her car." The other DEA agent raised a hand, cutting him off. "We'll be handling this from here. You'll be placed under investigation for misconduct. Step aside." The officer didn't move immediately, his eyes wide with fear. He knew the gravity of the situation, but he didn't know how to back out gracefully. Monica's colleague took a step toward him, and with that movement, the officer knew he had no choice but to comply. Monica stood silently as the two agents took control of the situation. Her heart was still racing, but now it was with a sense of victory. The officer had made a mistake, and she was going to make sure he was held accountable. She had kept her cool, stayed focused, and now, the situation was in the hands of those who knew how to handle it. As the officer was led away by the agents, Monica stood still, watching him with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. He had underestimated her, and now he would pay the price for it. But for Monica, this was just another day in the fight for justice. And she would keep fighting, no matter the odds. The dust had barely settled from the intense moment when Monica's backup arrived, but the atmosphere still felt heavy, the tension lingering like the fading sound of screeching tires. Monica's heart was still pounding in her chest, but there was a sense of relief as she watched her colleagues take control of the situation. The officer, who had been so confident moments before, was now led away, his head hung low in defeat. Monica didn't say a word as she watched him being escorted to the back of the SUV. She didn't need to say anything, his actions had spoken volumes, and now it was time for the consequences. Her two colleagues, both seasoned agents from the DEA, stood nearby, talking quietly among themselves as they processed the events. Monica knew that the situation was far from over. The officer might have been taken away, but the aftermath of what had just happened would have lasting effects. Not just for the officer, but for Monica as well. She had no idea just how deep this went, how many others within the department might be involved. But she did know one thing: she couldn't let this go. Not now, not after everything she had worked for. The younger agent, a woman named Sarah, approached Monica first. She was a sharp, no-nonsense professional, and Monica had always respected her work. Sarah was calm, but her eyes were filled with a quiet intensity. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Monica nodded slowly. "I'm fine. But we both know this is far from over." Sarah's expression hardened. "You're right. We need to move quickly. I'll call internal affairs. They need to know what just happened here." Monica didn't argue. She had already anticipated this. The moment the officer had planted that evidence in her car, the clock had started ticking. Every second that passed meant the chance of exposing this corruption was slipping away. But Monica had spent her life in law enforcement, and she wasn't going to let the officer's actions go unchecked. She trusted Sarah's judgment. If anyone could handle the situation, it was Sarah. As Sarah made the call, Monica turned her attention to the other agent, Paul. He had been with her for years, and she knew she could count on him to keep his head cool in situations like this. Paul was tall, with a quiet demeanor and a sharp mind. He had seen everything from gang violence to white-collar corruption, and nothing rattled him. He walked up to Monica, his brow furrowed in thought. "What's the next move?" he asked. Monica exhaled, her breath shaky but steadying as she found her footing once more. "We can't just let it slide. We need to make sure we have every piece of evidence we need to expose this." Paul gave her a nod of agreement. "You're right. The officer's actions might be just the tip of the iceberg. If he's part of something bigger, we need to know who else is involved. We're going to have to dig deep." Monica knew that Paul's words weren't just about the officer they had just dealt with. They were about a deeper system of corruption, one that might run through the police force and even higher up. She had spent years working alongside law enforcement to combat illegal activities, but never had she imagined that she would face this kind of challenge. She had always believed in the system, trusted it to work fairly, but now she was forced to confront the harsh reality that not everyone in the system shared her sense of justice. As the two agents continued to discuss their strategy, Monica turned her gaze back toward the officer, now sitting quietly in the back of the squad car. He was no longer the confident man who had pulled her over. Instead, he seemed defeated, his earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. Monica couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to take such extreme measures. Had he acted alone, or was there a larger network at play? As the conversation with Internal Affairs continued, Monica's mind kept circling back to those questions. What if the officer wasn't just one bad apple? What if there were others, quietly pulling the strings from within, waiting for the right moment to strike? She knew that if she didn't act quickly, this incident could be swept under the rug. The officer might become the scapegoat, taking the fall for a deeper, more insidious problem. Monica couldn't allow that to happen. She wasn't going to let a few corrupt individuals tarnish everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. Finally, Sarah ended the call, her expression grim. Internal Affairs is on their way. They're sending a team to investigate everything: this officer, the drugs, the whole situation. They're taking it seriously. Monica nodded, though she knew that this was just the beginning. Internal Affairs would conduct their investigation, but that didn't mean it would be over. She had seen firsthand how things could be buried, how the wheels of justice could turn slowly or not at all. She had been in this business long enough to know that even the most well-meaning investigations could be thwarted by the wrong people. "We have to stay ahead of this," Monica said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to make sure we have everything we need to protect ourselves, to protect this investigation. I want every bit of information on this officer: his background, his history, any connections he might have." Paul's eyes met hers, and he gave a solemn nod. "Understood. We'll get to work right away." Monica watched as Sarah and Paul began making their calls, reaching out to other contacts, gathering information on the officer and his potential connections. They were efficient, relentless in their pursuit of the truth. Monica knew that with their help, they could uncover whatever lay beneath the surface. The officer might have thought he had won, but he had just unwittingly opened a door to something much bigger. As the evening dragged on, Monica found herself pacing, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a case of one officer making a mistake. There were too many unknowns, too many unanswered questions. She had seen enough in her career to know when something didn't add up, and this didn't add up. The officer's actions were reckless, yes, but they also felt planned, deliberate. She couldn't ignore the possibility that someone had orchestrated this. As she stood in the dimming light, the cool night air filling her lungs, Monica made a vow to herself. She would see this through, no matter what it took. She wouldn't let the corruption within the system win. She would make sure that the people behind this officer's actions were exposed and brought to justice. Her role as the director of the DEA wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility. And Monica was going to fulfill that responsibility, no matter the cost. The night stretched on, but Monica remained steadfast in her resolve. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. And she would fight until the very end. The days that followed the incident were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and relentless investigation. Monica had barely slept, her mind consumed with the aftermath of what had happened. The officer who had pulled her over was now at the center of an internal affairs investigation, but Monica knew that the investigation was far from over. What had started as a routine traffic stop had quickly spiraled into something far more complex, and Monica was determined to see it through to the end. She wasn't about to let the system she had worked so hard to build get taken down by a few bad apples. Monica had made sure to keep herself involved in every step of the process. She wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines while others did the work. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know how things worked and how they didn't. She knew that the higher UPS could sometimes sweep things under the rug if no one was watching. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She had to be vigilant, keep the pressure on, and make sure this officer's actions didn't go unnoticed. As the days passed, more troubling information came to light. The officer, whose name was David Thompson, had been with the department for 5 years. On the surface, he seemed to have a spotless record, but the deeper Monica dug, the more she realized that things weren't as they seemed. Thompson had been involved in several questionable situations in the past, though none of them had been serious enough to warrant an investigation. He had brushed off those incidents, always managing to talk his way out of trouble. But now, With the drugs he had planted in Monica's car, his actions had crossed a line. There was no way to talk his way out of this one. Monica sat in her office late one evening, going through the files on Thompson. She had been reviewing his records for hours, piecing together the puzzle. The more she learned, the more she began to suspect that Thompson wasn't acting alone. There had to be someone higher up who had either turned a blind eye to his actions or had been involved in them. The idea gnawed at her. If this officer had been part of a larger operation, it could mean that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Just as she was about to dive deeper into the files, there was a knock at her door. Monica looked up to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her expression serious. "You've got a visitor," Sarah said, stepping aside to let a man enter the room. Monica didn't recognize the man, but he looked like someone from Internal Affairs. His crisp suit and no-nonsense demeanor made it clear that he was there for business. "Monica Williams," the man asked, his voice deep and authoritative. "That's me," Monica replied, standing up and offering her hand. "And you are?" "Agent Mark Collins," he said, shaking her hand. "I've been assigned to the investigation regarding Officer Thompson. I wanted to speak with you about what happened." Monica gestured for him to take a seat. "Please, sit down. I've been going over Thompson's records myself, and I have a few questions of my own." Collins took a seat across from her, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. "I've been briefed on the situation. I know you've been working with Internal Affairs on this, but I need to hear from you directly. I need to know everything." Monica hesitated for a moment, weighing her words carefully. She had been through this kind of thing before, agents and officials coming in to take control, questioning everything. But she also knew that this was her chance to make sure the investigation stayed on track. She had to trust Collins, even if she didn't know him personally. "I was pulled over by Officer Thompson," Monica began, recounting the events of that night. "I knew something wasn't right from the moment I saw him. The search of my car was unnecessary, and when he found the drugs, I knew they had been planted. It wasn't just a routine stop. It was a setup." Collins listened intently, taking notes as she spoke. "And you're certain he planted the drugs?" he asked, looking up from his notebook. Monica nodded. "Without a doubt. I've been in this line of work long enough to recognize a setup when I see one. Thompson was too quick to find what he was looking for. And the moment I made it clear who I was, his demeanor changed. It was like he thought he had won." "Do you think he acted alone?" Collins asked, his voice calm but probing. Monica didn't hesitate. "No. There's someone behind him. Thompson's been involved in too many questionable situations for it to be just a coincidence. He's been getting away with things for years, and I think it's because someone has been protecting him." Collins leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "We've been digging into Thompson's history. There are a few things that don't add up. He's been involved in some minor incidents, but nothing that raised any red flags. Until now, that is. But you're right. There's something bigger here." Monica felt a surge of determination. "We need to dig deeper. Whoever is behind him needs to be exposed. And we need to make sure Thompson doesn't walk away from this." Collins nodded. "That's exactly what we're doing. We've already put a team together to look into this. But I need you to stay on this with us. Your knowledge, your experience, it's invaluable." Monica didn't need to be asked twice. "I'm in. I've spent my life in law enforcement. I won't let someone like Thompson tear it all down." As Collins left her office, Monica sat back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had always believed in justice, in doing what was right. But now, she was about to uncover a web of corruption that could shake the very foundation of everything she had worked for. She couldn't afford to fail. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late nights spent going through records. Monica and the team from Internal Affairs worked tirelessly to uncover every lead, every connection that could tie Thompson to a larger network of corruption. The more they dug, the more they found. It wasn't just Thompson who had been involved in shady dealings, it was others, too. Officers, detectives, and even a few high-ranking officials. The web of corruption was far wider than Monica had imagined, and she knew that exposing it would be a challenge like no other. As the investigation progressed, Monica found herself at the forefront of a battle she hadn't expected. She had always been the one in charge, the one making the decisions. But now, she was one of the many who were trying to clean up the mess. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now, not when everything was on the line. Finally, after weeks of relentless work, the team was ready. They had gathered enough evidence to take action. Thompson was arrested, along with several others involved in the operation. The network of corruption had been dismantled, and the people responsible for it were brought to justice. It wasn't an easy victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Monica stood in front of the media, her face calm and composed as she spoke about the investigation. She didn't dwell on the personal aspects of the case, but instead focused on the larger issue, the importance of accountability, the need for law enforcement to be held to the highest standards. In the end, justice had been served. But for Monica, the real victory was knowing that she had stayed true to her principles, that she had fought for what was right, no matter the cost.